2020 was an interesting year, to put it lightly, but on the video game side of things, it was just more of the same. Hyped up disappointments, enjoyable surprises, and a little of everything in between. I had originally planned to review Ring Fit Adventure, but things got complicated that year and I've since completely fallen off my workout routine. At this point, I don't know if I'll bother, but I'll try to keep it in mind for 2021. Anyway, on to the point, I'll briefly go over everything that I've reviewed over the last year, as well as an extra that snuck into January. But I'll be starting with the worst to best of the movies. Without any intended exaggeration, Resident Evil Apocalypse may very well be one of the single worst movies I have ever seen. And it's the lowest score I've given for a movie so far. Bad story presentation, poor character usage, just straight up embarrassing dialogue. The few positives this movie does have, the set design and Nemesis rubber suit costume, are completely overshadowed by all the negatives. A complete waste of time. It's barely worth watching even just to laugh at it. A kaiju horror thriller strictly from a human perspective and a grand scale of destruction. Cloverfield should have been such a cool movie, but the pacing is slow as molasses and the characters are ass interesting. Someone had a good idea with this movie, but the execution was so stupid. Who decided to make the entire first quarter play out like an MTV reality show? This isn't saying much, but so far, this is the best Resident Evil live-action movie I've seen. The tone is more reasonable in comparison to the first two, and sometimes I can actually see what's happening in the action scenes. It's still not any good, I wouldn't recommend it, and I can't imagine that the sequels are going to make much of a difference. But this is at least a step in the right direction. This one's got the look and feel of a direct-to-DVD production nailed down, and that's not a compliment. I appreciate the nods to the source material here and there, and some moments are pretty cool. This one's not too bad to check out for curiosity's sake, but don't expect too much out of it. Finally rounding off this list of video game movies is the big-budget Hollywood release of Sonic the Hedgehog. Yet another weird origin story with its own set of rules, and a goofy dynamic between the two main characters. But I suppose it could have been a lot worse. Jim Carrey did alright as the lead villain, but overall, it's just average. Not bad, but not a big deal. Okay, now this is so bad it's good. This is such a ridiculous and over-the-top movie that I can't help but laugh at it. Unlike Resident Evil Apocalypse and Cloverfield, the entire cast of characters serve a purpose. And the action sequences are both fun to watch and easy to follow. It's not a great movie, it's needlessly slow sometimes, and the ending sequence has a ton of artificial tension. But it does manage to be pretty enjoyable, as long as you're prepared for some schlock. This movie is pretty short, slow, a little boring, and there isn't really a whole lot of character development or much of a plot. But man, this is such a fun movie to watch. It's so creative and funny, and the moments of horror can be surprisingly thrilling. I kind of wish there was a little more to this movie, but that might take away some of the charm too. It's a weird one to recommend, but give it a chance and you might be pleasantly surprised. Wacky, over-the-top characters and scenarios, a little bit of a superhero story, a little bit of influence from They Live, wrapped around humorous dialogue, cool characters, and awesome action. I feel like the focus and pacing is a little all over the place. The movie comes off like it's trying to do too much at once, but the animation and setting alone make this well worth checking out. Wacky, over-the-top characters and scenarios. Again. Unlike MFKZ, however, Dead Leaves knows exactly what it wants to be. and it covers so much while making absolutely sure not to waste a viewer's time. It might even move a little too fast, but the hilarious characters and awesome action make it worth watching all the same. It's just a shame that the movie is so short, but there's something special about this one that really makes me love it. Drive attempts a balance of art through cinematography, along with great dialogue and crazy action. There are just a couple of little things here and there that bother me, most of all being the relationship between the main character and the love interest. But overall, this movie is incredibly good. You might not like it as much if you're looking more so for action and a faster pace, but Drive most definitely rewards the patient. I think District 9 should appeal to just about everyone. Well-developed and compelling characters, a creative and unique setting, and some cool as hell action thrown in for good measure. The plot points can be a bit too convenient, and the otherwise excellent special effects have very minor imperfections here and there that do stand out. But every other aspect, from the pacing to the themes to the acting, I have so few negatives to say, almost nothing but praise, and very little to offer in the way of improvements. It's not perfect, but it's so close. Before I start listing and ranking the video games, here are the notable mentions that sit somewhere between the best and the worst, in no particular order. I know this one's a fan favorite, but it's so dreadfully boring early on. After about 6 hours, it does manage to pick up, but the lack of meaningful customization hurts this game a lot as an RPG, and the writing is sadly subpar. It's not too bad, and I think most people who know what they're getting into will enjoy it, but this game isn't a big deal either. Well, the dialogue and story are a lot better than the original Paper Mario, but that's about it. The RPG-style combat has been replaced with this weird puzzle approach. It kind of works, but I don't think the game took it far enough, and besides, I would have preferred the more traditional system. The look of the game is beautiful and the characters are great, but there's a lot of room for improvement, and this one isn't anything special. I'm surprised at how well the story and characters managed to hold up, and I like to believe it's not just my nostalgia talking. Aside from the poor English translation, this is a great world to get lost in and explore. There's also some fantastic customization opportunities for more invested players to sink their teeth into, and a good amount of secrets to discover. The fatal flaw, however, is that the vast majority of the gameplay is totally unengaging. A few noteworthy moments here and there, but most of the combat is extremely dry and basic, even for an RPG. Final Fantasy VII is great as a beginner's RPG, but there's more demanding stuff out there too. Man, what a weird franchise, and Dino Crisis 2 is definitely the best of the bunch. It's not great, not by a wide margin. The camera and enemy aggression are both so obnoxious as to taint the entire game. However, it controls well enough, the gameplay style is creative, and the story is so bad it's good. For those seeking that missing link between Resident Evil 3 and 4, Dino Crisis 2 is worth looking into. Next up are the bad, the poor, and the ugly. The bottom 10 of 2020. I don't know where the hell Capcom went wrong. Resident Evil 2 Remake was so masterful that I figured this would have been a shoo-in for more success. But an overemphasis on the dodging mechanic, significantly worse AI, and extremely linear level design only left me with a bad taste. It's still an okay game, and it does have its moments, but I know Capcom is capable of so much more, and they clearly phoned it in for this one. Biggest disappointment of 2020, God, what a shame. I like the way Diabolical Mind puts their games together, I'm a little bit of a fan, but there's always a few things here and there that irk me. This one's not nearly as grind heavy as Riddled Corpses, and the slight attribute differences between characters is nice, but it's still a very shallow and short game. If you have a like-minded friend to play with in co-op, then you might get some mileage out of this, but don't expect too much. As if Dino Crisis 2 wasn't already weird enough, this one has gone completely off the deep end. While it is very unique and creative, and probably the best off-rails light gun game out there, it's also a pain to control and severely lacking in content, even for a light gun game. There's a lot of potential here, but hardly any of it was reached. At least you can still laugh at the hilariously bad story. Wonderful 101 could have been so cool, but the awkward camera and drawing system bring it down real hard. Couple that with half the weapons overlapping each other in usefulness, and constant half-baked set pieces that completely alter the gameplay, and you have a game that's trying to do way too much and only succeeding at being annoying. I'll give credit where credit is due, it is quite creative and interesting, more so than the average game, but I just don't feel like it works most of the time. It is the kind of game that gets better with repeat playthroughs, but it did not sell me on my initial run, and I think that counts for a lot. I heard this was Resident Evil with dinosaurs, and I was instantly sold. Man, what a letdown. It de-emphasizes enemy positioning, item storage is made needlessly more complex, and they got really carried away with the puzzles. It's so bizarre. If Resident Evil 1 let the player take documents with them, then why not Dino Crisis? And it was handled by the same director. All these games are so weird, but the first one made the least sense. I don't care that this game is literally made for children. I think a higher standard is not asking for too much here. The art direction is nice, but the graphics and animation are absolute garbage. Customizing your team from so many monsters is awesome, but nearly the entire game being based around 1 versus 1 matches and only having 4 moves per Pokemon is severely lacking. So much of the game feels archaic, and Nintendo is clearly very content with resting on their laurels. I actually didn't care about Cyberpunk initially, and I wasn't planning to play this game at all. So I find it kind of funny that this game turned out better than I expected, while everyone else is losing their minds over how bad it is. Constant glitches, worthless enemy AI, a lack in weapon variety, and meager customization opportunities, there is a lot to improve upon. However, I do like the direction it attempted to go in, and I found the story and the characters to be very enjoyable. Of course, it's difficult to enjoy what's there when the game keeps crashing on you. I really wanted to like this game, and I think, in concept, it's super cool. But the PlayStation 4 version is, without exaggeration, unplayable to the point that it is insane for it to be sold in its current state. It's a sickening kind of dark comedy that Cyberpunk 2077 has been removed from digital stores. But Pathologic 2 remains without ever receiving a single update to fix its errors, now having been over 10 months since release on the PlayStation 4. It is despicable and such a shame because there's a lot about this game that's great, but it really is borderline unplayable. Cyberpunk 2077 is bad, but this, at least the PC version works. This absolute psychopath seriously made the same game twice. The graphics have been updated and it looks a little bit nicer, and that's it. The new levels, not even worth it. There's really nothing to say here. The sequel is just as much a waste of time as the first game. This is one of those games that is legendarily bad. I'm talking Sonic 2006, Amy, agony quality of bad. The kind of game that you have to play for yourself to really get it. It's crazy because there are some ambitious ideas here, and those fire effects are pretty rad. But the controls are terrible, the environments are awful, and the story, it must be played firsthand to be believed. It truly is something else, and easily the worst game I played in 2020. And finally, moving on to some good news, the top 10 of 2020. This one barely made it onto the list, and admittedly, I'm probably biased here. But there's just something about this game that I absolutely love. I don't want to say that this game has soul, but it does feel like the team behind this game really enjoyed putting it together. If nothing else, those boss fights are absolutely magnificent. I don't know where you've gone, Treasure, but I'll keep holding on to hope that you'll return one day. Every bit as hilarious as it is fun to play, Metal Wolf Chaos is so over the top and insane that it needs to be experienced firsthand. It's unfortunate that the game doesn't feel fully realized. It's lacking in content, and balance issues make most of the guns useless. But I commend the attempt, and there's a lot more good than bad here. By far the best video game there is for celebrating the 4th of July. There's not a whole lot to this game, but it did manage to pull off its goals very well. It looks great, the controls are good, and there's a surprising amount of variety to the level design. I wouldn't necessarily outright recommend it, but I think this is a good game. This one's got a ton of balance issues, and all the updates adding more abilities have only made it crazier. But personally, I like this game quite a bit. It's really weird to try and get used to, but it is fun once you have an understanding of all the characters and their strengths and weaknesses. That said, hopefully Capcom can make a proper Outbreak 3 next time, but I won't hold my breath. Having the party's health and magic restored after every battle may sound like an attempt to casualize the game, but it's actually balanced around this pretty well. Battles may go on for a little too long, and the difficulty curve is a bit of a roller coaster, but I appreciate how different and valuable each individual party member is, as well as an emphasis on planning ahead and locking bosses into a checkmate with proper strategies. It's not too amazing of a game, but I think this is a good turn-based RPG that fans of the genre should look into. Most people might look at this one and see it as a Dark Souls clone, but I'd say it has a lot more in common with Metroid. What with an emphasis on exploration, a handful of maps to fill out, and various upgrades necessary to progress through the game. Generally speaking, everything about it is put together pretty solidly. Combat mechanics, level design, enemy variety, it all comes together very well. It's just missing a little bit of that extra to be really special. And a few design oversights, such as a lack of greater mobility options, bring it down just a tad. However, it's a good game overall, and I think it should appeal to most people, Star Wars fan or not. Of all the games to be disappointed in, this one I expected the least. It's still an absolutely excellent game. I don't want to imply that Doom Eternal isn't fantastic, but there are more than a few little design decisions that I disagree with. Way more of an emphasis on storytelling, constant tutorial pop-ups, and some really odd additions like swimming and this stupid purple goo. It's not all bad, the new enemy weak points are awesome, and the enhanced mobility options are an excellent addition. I'm still not 100% satisfied with the weapon balancing in Doom Eternal, and the leveling up and upgrades still don't add much to the gameplay or sense of progression, in my opinion. Both of these were issues I had with Doom 2016 as well, but pile on everything else that Doom Eternal has problems with, on top of a multiplayer mode that I think is worse than it was in Doom 2016, as well as a lack of snap map or modding options on PC. But when all is said and done, this is still a ton of fun and it's worth anyone's time. I was already a huge fan of Resident Evil 2, despite finding more than a few flaws with it, but I had never played the original Resident Evil 3 before. It's essentially more of the same, but more refined in so many ways. The initial downtown map has some non-linear progression, gunpowder mixing allows for more creativity and item management, and there's just enough randomization to keep the game exciting, but without making it frustrating. Nemesis is probably the best boss fight out of the original trilogy, and the new dodge mechanic adds that little extra that was missing from the previous two games without requiring the player to master it to enjoy the game. Only having one campaign does hurt quite a bit, but I think this is the best Resident Evil game on the PS1. Final Fantasy VII Remake came really close to hitting number 1 this year. The combat, menu implementation, and general pacing were very awkward at first, but I absolutely fell in love with the game as I understood more of its inner workings. Swapping between party members is such a cool mechanic, and so many of the boss fights, and even more than a few regular enemy encounters, required a careful approach to deal with and were so satisfying to fight. There's a good amount of optional content, but not to such an extreme that it becomes overwhelming. And that final Super Boss Gauntlet was one of the most fun challenges that I tackled last year. As the cherry on top, nearly every aspect of the story and presentation was masterfully executed. But where it does falter in this regard, it falters hard enough to bring down the overall quality of the rest of the game. The inclusion of the Spectres is so bad, even just from a storytelling perspective, that it brings down the entire rest of the game's quality. It's not something I ever expected to feel, but it really does make me hate the whole game that much more. Still, I can appreciate where Final Fantasy VII Remake flies high, and when it does so remarkably well. Bug Fables is so good. It pretty much manages to get everything right. Story, characters, the flow of combat, variety of enemies, level of customization, sense of exploration, number of optional content, and a fantastic sense of progression in both the plot and in gameplay. It's such a shame then that where it does fall flat, it's these little mistakes that feel amateurish. Menus for item storage are needlessly sluggish, money in this game is very oddly balanced, and castling your team can only be done in rotation, rather than by swapping, which limits the potential creativity that combat could have. These negatives bring down the game a fair bit, but in a recent update, it seems like they've actually gone back to fix a few of these issues on top of adding even more content. It's still not perfect, the texture work could be better, and some traversal abilities aren't all that satisfying. But hey, there's always room for a sequel. I am very much looking forward to Moonsprout Games' next project, whatever it might be. The top 6 games in particular that I played in 2020 were so much fun to go through, and even a few oddballs here and there were surprisingly enjoyable as well. Hell, even Cyberpunk, as junky as that game is, managed to surprise me with some of its elements. However, the theme of 2020 was most definitely one of disappointment. Resident Evil 3 Remake and Paper Mario The Origami King, while these games were fine, they certainly weren't good enough. Doom Eternal and Final Fantasy VII Remake may have been excellent overall, but some less than stellar design decisions keep them from being as good as they could have been. As for 2021, there's not a whole lot on the horizon that I'm looking forward to, even on my fancy new PlayStation 5. I'll probably get Resident Evil 8, but there's not much else. I do have a couple of plans coming up, like finally getting around to my review of Control, and I'll never run out of older games to revisit. But I hate making promises, so we'll just wait and see. Thanks for watching, and I know I'm awfully late in saying this, but Happy New Year, everyone.